He looked off camera, then back. I'm leaving something behind. Not to destroy, to teach. It's in the lab at 42 Hatherley Street. Room 31. It's safe. It won't ignite. But it will explain everything. The video ended. I brought the footage to Wolfe and waited for his ruling. He didn't speak for a full minute after it played. Then finally, he wants us to come. Trap. No. He has relinquished the weapon. He wants it found. Understood. You believe him? I believe he has surrendered. Whether that is redemption or fatigue, I do not know. But it will end there. I made the trip that afternoon. Took Saul with me, just in case. The address was a converted industrial building, used for university research overflow. Clean, quiet, and half abandoned on weekends. Room 301 held a single desk, a single chair, and one long bench stacked with labeled components, tubes, coils, flasks, manuals. There was no device, only a notebook, spiral-bound, handwritten in a precise, steady hand. Combustion as conversation, a personal study in intent. It wasn't a bomb. It was a thesis. 50 pages of it. I skimmed, then reread certain parts. It detailed Maida's principles, her experiments, and Julian's efforts to recreate her work using safer models, more advanced controls. He outlined why he built the devices, how he calibrated them to mimic accidents, how he never intended to kill, and why, after seeing the consequences, he'd stop. On the final page was a note. To Mr. Wolfe, I thought I could continue a fire without hurting anyone. You proved otherwise. Let this be the last chapter. J. We left the lab as it was, sealed, documented, passed it along to Kramer, who arrived in person the next day with a team from the state fire marshal's office. They combed it, verified the contents, and took Ray into custody without incident later that week. There were no charges of arson, no deaths tied to him. Just a long, quiet conversation with 2 investigators and a psychologist. Wolfe never asked for the transcripts. He said they'd be full of excuses. Instead, he asked me to put the notebook in the drawer beside the original folder. A very Maida incident. The fire at dusk. Subfolder. Ray, Julian. Cessation. Wolfe allowed himself 1 beer that evening, earlier than usual. We sat in the office with the windows open, the spring breeze filtering in like a truce. You did it, I said, tapping the notebook. No flames, no sirens, just a page. He did it, Wolfe corrected. He ended it. The fire stopped with him, but not with guilt. No, Wolfe said. That continues, as it should. He stared at the fireplace. Empty, cold, as it had been since the case began. There is a paradox in fire, he murmured. It consumes, but it illuminates. It destroys, but it reveals. And people keep confusing one for the other. Yes, he said. Because they think fire is a tool. It is not. It is a verdict. I looked over. That going to be your next book title? No. It is my dessert course. Fritz arrived 5 minutes later, with warm poached pears in cinnamon syrup. The only smoke in the room came from the kitchen, and as we sat in the heavy hush of a mystery finally extinguished, I knew Wolfe wasn't just satisfied. He was settled. No case is ever finished. Not really. But some are closed tightly enough to stay shut. And this one, flickering at the edges of ideology and obsession, had finally gone dark, but not forgotten. Wolfe never forgets. He simply files. And I write. The brownstone had returned to its natural rhythm. That meant Fritz humming in the kitchen, orchids flourishing in the rooftop greenhouse, and Wolfe immersed once again in the world of Pliny, Horace, and occasionally Gourmet. It had been 2 weeks since Julian Ray had been quietly taken into custody. His devices dismantled, his notebook shelved, and his ideology, such as it was, reduced to paper and testimony. He cooperated fully, even as he insisted he meant no harm. Wolfe dismissed that as rationalization without merit, and chose not to dignify it with debate. I asked Wolfe once, while he was trimming the dead stem of a Cattleya Traiane, whether he thought Ray would try again. No, Wolfe said calmly. He built for belief. That belief has now collapsed. What remains is shame, and shame is rarely combustible. The world, meanwhile, had already moved on. No headlines, no trials, just a quiet paragraph in a regional paper about a disturbed man and a decommissioned lab. The public never knew how close it had come to a third fire or a third martyr. The only thing left was the final conversation. Not with Wolfe. With me. One afternoon I got a letter. No return address again. But it wasn't from Ray, or Marwick, or anyone who'd appeared in Wolfe's office. Just a modest envelope containing a single page, neatly written in careful script. It read, "I watched the smoke clear and realized it was not the world I wanted to change. It was myself. Thank you for stopping me in time. J.R." I showed it to Wolfe. He read it once and passed it back with no comment. "You're not going to respond?" I asked. "No," Wolfe said. "It was not addressed to me." Fair enough. That evening Fritz served roast chicken with black truffle stuffing. Wolfe complimented it with particular emphasis, which for him was high praise. He poured himself a second beer, gestured for silence, and finally said, "Archie, do you know the only thing more dangerous than an intelligent man with a cause? Albeit a mediocre one, with a martyr." I set down my fork. "That's what you think Julian was." "No. That's what he might have become." Miss Downs lit the match, but he was preparing the bonfire. He would have built a movement around it, one of meaning, grief, and misremembered brilliance. Maida Avery did not ask for worship. She demanded understanding, and her disciples failed her in both. Do you think she'd be angry about how they used her name? No, Wolfe said, disappointed. There was a pause, heavy with the weight of a dozen conversations we'd never had. I cleared the plates, stacked the napkins, and turned off the dining room light. Later in the office, Wolfe dictated one final note for the file. Case closed. Primary actors in custody or under supervision. No further threats observed. Ideological origin noted and archived. The line between passion and delusion, once crossed, cannot be redrawn. N.W. I sealed the folder myself. A very minor incident. The fire at dusk. Filed. Labeled. Done. As I turned off the office light, I looked back once at the room. Still. Ordered. Undisturbed. And yet for a moment, I thought I saw the faintest shimmer in the hearth's cold iron grate. Not smoke. Not heat. Just memory. Some fires don't die. They just go quiet. And in this house, that's all they're ever allowed to do. At dusk, flames lit the sky and buried a secret no one saw coming. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Drop a comment. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Your words make this storytelling experience come alive. There are two things Nero Wolfe doesn't tolerate before dinner: interruptions and anything that smells vaguely like obligation. So when the doorbell rang at 6:33 p.m., a time sacred for sipping beer and sighing over Fritz's sauce, my first instinct was to ignore it and let the intruder marinate in their poor timing. But the ring wasn't the usual kind. It wasn't tentative like someone lost in a brownstone jungle, and it wasn't urgent like a woman with tears and tails. No, this one had weight behind it. Confident, sharp. And I don't know what possessed me, but I went to the door. The man on the stoop looked like he belonged to two different centuries at once. Thin mustache, tailored coat, and a hat with a brim, too dramatic for this decade. In one hand, he held a battered leather briefcase. In the other, a small box, half wrapped in brown paper. He smelled faintly of cologne and cinders. "I need to speak to Mr. Wolfe," he said. "Tonight, immediately." "Buddy," I told him, leaning on the frame, "you're about 12 minutes too late for immediately and exactly 4 hours too early for tomorrow. So unless that box holds a still beating heart or something edible and apologetic, you're not going to make it past the vestibule. I know Mr. Wolfe doesn't take clients after 6. That's why I didn't come as a client. He shifted the box slightly. I came as a witness. I'll admit, he had my attention. And Wolfe's rules, while rigid, have loopholes you could steer a cab through if you knew how to twist the right phrase. So I took a calculated risk and cracked the door open a little wider. Start walking, pal, quietly, and try not to touch anything. He followed me in, trailing smoke and nerve like a noir fog. When I stepped into the office, Wolfe had his eyes closed and a glass of beer cradled like it was a relic. He didn't open them. "Archie," he said, "unless that is Fritz holding a platter of veal kidneys, send it back." The man cleared his throat. "Mr. Wolfe, forgive the intrusion. My name is Duncan Avery. I've brought you something I believe will be inconveniently relevant. You may recall the name. My aunt was Maida Avery. That did it." Wolfe's eyes opened. Just a flicker, but enough for me to know the name meant something. "She passed in February," Avery added, quite suddenly. "I do not attend funerals," Wolfe said. "No one asked you to." Avery placed the box gently on the edge of the desk. "This arrived at my apartment this morning. No note. No sender. It was once part of her estate. I opened it at dusk, Mr. Wolfe, and 5 minutes later, the fire started." He paused. "Not dramatically, but factually. My building is gone." I looked at the box. No smoke. No ticking. No ominous chanting. "I saved this," he added, "and I came straight here." Wolfe tapped the armrest once. "Sit." Avery sat. So did I, because something in Wolfe's face shifted from mild disgust to the early stages of engagement. For him, that was practically an adrenaline rush. He finally addressed Avery directly. "If you are not a client, Mr. Avery, what is it you are asking?" "I'm asking you," Avery said, folding his hands, "to open that box. Look at what's inside, and then tell me whether I'm going mad, or someone is trying very hard to make me believe I am." Wolfe didn't move. Not even an eyebrow. That might sound like a lack of reaction, but I'd seen the man crack a case on the arch of a brow alone. His stillness now meant his brain was already moving like a diesel engine under velvet. He looked at the box, then at Avery, then at me. "Archie." The gloves. I went to the drawer and got the thin pair he used when he deigned to handle something the world had touched too freely. He didn't put them on himself, of course. I slipped them over his fingers like a nurse prepping a patient for surgery. "Open it," he said. I lifted the top gently. The wrapping had already been torn. Avery wasn't lying about opening it at dusk. Inside was a small metal frame, probably brass, with 4 legs like a miniature table. Beneath it, blackened paper curled like it had tried to escape, and on top of the frame, placed like a crown, was a glass vial, empty, with its cork burned to a crisp. Wolfe gave a sound I'd learned to identify as interest. Not curiosity, not alarm. Just the alert bell of a man whose intellect had been offered in a hors d'oeuvre. "Describe the fire," he said to Avery without looking away from the object. "It started in my study. First the drapes, then the floorboard, near the radiator. The alarm went off, and the sprinklers failed. By the time the fire department arrived, it had jumped to the neighboring unit. I barely got out with the box." "You live alone?" "Yes, but the building's full. Dozens of tenants. 2 injured, 1 still in the hospital. Carbon monoxide." Wolfe's lips pressed together. "And this," he said, gesturing at the frame and vial, "was delivered without sender or note." "Exactly. I opened it. I saw this contraption, and then it was like something shifted in the room. I don't know how to explain it. Heat, maybe. Then the fire alarms. It couldn't have been coincidence. And my aunt, Maida, she was always cryptic, even in death. You believe this was intended as a message?" "I don't know what I believe, but I don't want the next box to arrive tomorrow." Wolfe made a humming sound that in his vernacular meant continue. "My aunt was eccentric. A retired chemist, specialized in flame retardants for industrial use. But in private, she was experimental, compulsive. She used to say things like 'fire remembers,' We thought it was a metaphor. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. Or a confession. Very's face didn't move. Look, I'm not here for poetry. I need to know if this is sabotage, a threat, or just the last of her ghostly gestures. Ghosts don't use the postal service, I said. No, Wolfe murmured. But people do. Archie, you will deliver the box to Inspector Kramer in the morning. Ask him to have it examined by his bomb and arson division. I blinked. Wolfe didn't usually invite the law in this early, especially not with a box that hadn't actually exploded. You think it's a device? No. I think it is a message, as Mr. Avery suspects, but I am not in the business of fire forensics. I am in the business of people, so let us begin there. He turned his eyes on Avery with the full weight of 7 digestives and a mind like a vise. You mentioned an estate. Your aunt had wealth? Some. Her patents paid steadily. The apartment was rent-controlled, but she'd invested in rare materials, flame-proof textiles, lab equipment. She didn't trust banks. Who handled her affairs after death? I did. I was the sole executor. And sole heir. No. The estate was split 4 ways. Me, her former assistant, her closest friend, and a charity. She was meticulous, but also prone to dramatic gestures. Names, Wolfe snapped. Not adjectives. A very tick of them off like matches. Ellen Marwick, friend of 20 years, lives in Brooklyn. David Sorrell, assistant for 7, then let go about 6 months before her death. And the charity was called Emberlight. Emberlight? Yes. An educational foundation she started. She said it was her way of passing fire to those who need it. I always assumed she meant opportunity. I glanced at Wolfe. He didn't like figurative speech in a factual conversation. She died how? Wolfe asked. Cardiac arrest. No autopsy. She was 78. Lived alone. She'd refused medical care for years. Did she have enemies? Avery paused, then gave the kind of laugh that doesn't reach the eyes. She collected them. University boards, industry rivals, grant rejections, but nothing that would make someone burn a building. You'd be surprised, I said. No, Wolfe said. He would not. He pressed his fingertips together. This visit will now be concluded. Mr. Avery, you will make yourself available to Mr. Goodwin for further inquiries. Give him the names and addresses of the 3 beneficiaries. Also, write down the exact time the package arrived, and who, if anyone, may have handled it besides yourself. Avery nodded and reached into his briefcase for a notebook. He scribbled quickly and tore out the page. As he stood to go, Wolfe added, "You will remain at a hotel tonight, not your own home. Leave the address with Mr. Goodwin." Avery looked as if he'd already planned that. Of course. As the door clicked shut behind him, Wolfe exhaled through his nose. Not a sigh, just air leaving a sealed container. I waited. After a moment, he spoke. Someone intended that device to be seen. Whether it caused the fire or not is immaterial. It is symbolic. It is theatrical. It is personal. I sat on the edge of the red chair. And Wolfe said, "We will allow the fire to do what fire does best. Reveal." Then he rang for Fritz. Dinner was served, and not a single word was spoken until dessert. But even as Wolfe savored a custard he claimed was adequate, I could see it behind his eyes, the gears turning, the smoke curling. Tomorrow, I'd be knocking on the doors of 3 strangers, connected by an old chemist's flame, and Wolfe would be here, in his chair, drawing the lines from the ash. The next morning I was out the door, by 9:10 early by Wolfe's standards, late by anyone else's. The air had that early summer bite, where the sun shows up, but forgets to bring the heat, and I took it as a sign, a good day for doorbells and lies. First stop was Inspector Kramer. I'd called ahead, mostly to warn him, not to grumble about the surprise delivery. And he met me in his office with that look he reserves for homemade evidence and anything from Wolfe's brownstone. "This the box," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Wrapped in mystery and a whiff of arson," I said, setting it down carefully on his desk. "Wolfe wants your boys to give it the once-over. Vial, frame, Maybe chemical residue. We're not looking for fireworks, just proof someone wanted it to look like they'd lit a match. Kramer raised an eyebrow. And if it is just a chemistry set from Aunt Mabel's attic, then we go back to playing charades with a dead woman's social circle. He grunted, motioned to a uniform to take it to the lab, and turned back to me. What's Wolfe doing taking a fire case? You know Wolfe, I said. He doesn't care what the crime is, as long as it interrupts his dinner. This one did. Bad timing and all. I'll let you know what the lab finds. Much obliged. With that done, I headed out to meet the first of the beneficiaries, Ellen Marwick, the longtime friend. Her address in Brooklyn suggested tea cozies and yard cats, but her apartment surprised me, modern, sparse, and not a crocheted pillow in sight. She greeted me at the door with a wary smile and an Angelus neat hairstyle. I told Duncan I didn't want to be involved, she said the moment I introduced myself. I admired Maida, but I never claimed to understand her. I took a seat on the edge of her minimalist couch, which gave slightly under my weight like it wasn't sure about guests. We're just trying to make sense of something she left behind. A small device, mailed to Mr. Avery. A fire followed shortly after. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. You think she caused it? I think someone wants us to think that. I don't know if it's posthumous mischief or something more targeted. She folded her hands. Maida had two modes, brilliance and menace. Sometimes both in the same sentence. What kind of menace? She believed in consequences. When she felt someone was wasting their potential or her time, she said so, loudly. Her science was about prevention, but her personality wasn't. Any specific blow-ups in the last few years? She gave a tight smile. David Sorrell, her assistant. She fired him and wouldn't say why. Just called him combustible, which seemed ironic coming from her. Did she seem unsettled before her death? She was always unsettled. That was her comfort zone. But no, she wasn't afraid. Just tired. And very secretive. Any chance she had enemies who'd want to damage her reputation after death? Ellen shrugged. Anyone who ever funded her and regretted it. But spite from the grave isn't efficient. That wasn't her style. I thanked her, got her contact details, and left with the sense that she'd said everything she wanted to and nothing more. Next up, David Sorrell. He lived in a basement studio on the Lower East Side that smelled like damp ambition and coffee. He opened the door with an expression halfway between suspicion and hope. You're not from the patent office, he said. The patent office, he said. No. Just a private investigator with a couple of questions about your former boss. He let me in. The place was cluttered with papers, old lab equipment, and a stack of notebooks that looked like they hadn't been opened since Maida fired him. Maida was a genius, he said, almost too quickly. But she had her moods. She could praise you in the morning and accuse you of sabotage by lunch. She accused you. He hesitated. She said I wasn't careful, that I was too aggressive in my methodology. Were you? He smiled, but it didn't make it to his eyes. I pushed limits. She taught me to, until she decided I'd pushed the wrong one. Do you know why she left you part of the estate? His expression twisted into something like guilt or confusion. No. I thought she hated me by the end. Maybe it was penance. I stood, gave the place one last glance, and said, one last thing. A strange device turned up in Mr. Avery's possession, possibly linked to a fire that destroyed his apartment. Sorrell stiffened. You think she sent it? Or someone who knew her work well enough to fake it? His voice went low. Then they'd need her notebooks, or access to her lab. Did you keep any of her material? He looked like he wanted to lie, then shook his head. Just memories. I didn't believe him, but I didn't push. Not yet. Last stop was Emberlight, the charity. I'd called ahead and was told to meet the director, a brisk woman named Maritza Downs, at a cafe near Union Square. She showed up in tailored gray and didn't waste time. Maida gave us a modest grant and a name. That was it. She wanted us to teach kids about fire safety and chemical awareness. We added climate education. It was never a big foundation. Did she keep close contact? Emails every few months, suggestions, articles, but she didn't hover anyone in the organization who might have had access to her estate. Maritza looked genuinely confused. No, we weren't personal, just appreciative. She told me once that fire had ruined her life and saved it. I never asked what she meant. I paid the check and left, with more questions than answers, but the pattern was beginning to emerge. 3 beneficiaries with different relationships to Maida: respect, resentment, and reinvention. When I returned to the brownstone just after 5, Fritz handed me a note with his usual economy of expression. From Inspector Kramer, he said. He called twice. Wolfe was in the plant rooms, where I wasn't about to follow. I called Kramer from the kitchen phone. They ran the analysis, he said without greeting. It's not a bomb. It's a thermal release mechanism. A prototype, maybe. Set to react to air temperature and combustion elements. Delayed ignition. Some accelerant residue. Smart enough to look accidental, dangerous enough to torch a room. So it could have caused the fire. Yeah. And it wasn't the first time. We found a report of a similar apartment fire 3 months ago. Same structure, same signature, no deaths. Ruled electrical. But now we're reopening it. Anyone die in that fire? No. But the tenant was a former university dean. Got heat for denying Maida Avery a major research grant 20 years ago. I paused. That a fact? Starting to think your fat friend's onto something. I hung up, went to the office and waited until Wolfe reappeared, smelling like orchids and judgment. 2 fires. I told him. Both linked to people who crossed Maida Avery, same kind of device. First one's being reopened. Wolfe sat. Then our fire is not merely symbolic, Mr. Goodwin. It is serial, and the sender, an inheritor of ideology, or guilt, possibly both. He leaned back. Find out where Ellen Marwick was 3 months ago. Also, Mr. Sorrell. And I want to know if any of them had access to Maida Avery's notebooks. Somewhere, the instructions exist. And if they burned them, then they were fools. Fire may cleanse, but ash remembers. By the next morning, the game was no longer about identifying a device. It was about tracing a pattern, one that linked arson, inheritance, and a chemist, whose idea of legacy involved controlled combustion. Wolfe had barely spoken during breakfast, which was both a relief and a warning. When he's quiet through eggs and sausage, it usually means he's 4 steps ahead and waiting for me to catch up. Before I left, he gave instructions with the same casual precision he uses when selecting beer from the fridge. You will ascertain the whereabouts of Miss Marwick and Mr. Sorrell 3 months ago, with special attention to the week of February 17. The fire Kramer mentioned occurred on the 19th. I want timelines. Should I wear a trench coat and mutter about evidence, or just use the telephone like a sane person? Do as you please, but if you return without results, you will forgo dinner. With that incentive blazing in my future, I got to work. First on my list was Sorrell. I didn't want to give him time to rehearse. I showed up at his apartment just after 9. He answered the door with a toothbrush in his mouth, and the unmistakable look of someone trying to calculate whether this visit was good news, bad news, or a subpoena. Sorry to bother your enamel, I said, but I've got a quick question about February. Specifically the 17th through the 21st, where were you? He spat into a glass and wiped his mouth. Still working at the lab then. Not Maida's, a research co-op in Queens. Shared space for freelancers. I had a slot 3 mornings a week. Which mornings? Monday, Wednesday, Friday. February 19th was a Wednesday. He nodded, slowly. I was in the lab all morning. Then caught the train home. Why? Because a building went up in flames that night, and it might not have been spontaneous. He hesitated. You think Maida did it? No. I think someone used her science to make it look that way. He didn't like that. He looked over at the cluttered table by the window where a sheaf of yellowing lab notes sat half covered by an empty teacup. She wasn't a criminal, he muttered. People get creative after death. I left him frowning at his own guilt and crossed town to find Ellen Marwick. Her alibi came with tea and baked goods, both store-bought but politely arranged. I was in Maine that week, she said, brushing a crumb off her skirt. A friend owns a cottage near Kennebunkport. I go every February. Anyone who can confirm that? She nodded. Her name is Irene Delancey. I was there for 6 days. We read mystery novels and drank bourbon and tried to avoid the news. You're welcome to call her. I have the number. I took it, thanked her, and stepped outside into a fine drizzle that had ambitions of becoming real rain. From the corner bodega, I phoned Irene Delancey and got exactly what I expected. A warm-voiced woman who confirmed Ellen's presence that week, including an anecdote about a leaky roof in a Fox sighting. Back at the brownstone by early afternoon, I found Wolfe engaged in a delicate pruning maneuver on an orchid, with the same gravitas most men reserve for open-heart surgery. I waited until he finished slicing a dead stem and set the shears down. Sorrel says he was in the lab 3 mornings a week. I checked with the lab's administrator. He signed in at 9:12 and signed out at 2:30 on the 19th. They use a keycard system. Too tight for coincidence, Wolfe murmured. The fire began after 8 p.m. Yes, correct. And Ms. Marwick, Maine. Verified. With a friend who remembers the entire trip in high definition. Wolfe closed his eyes. Then either our culprit is not among them, or the timeline is dishonest. He rang for Fritz and ordered beer, his version of letting steam out without whistling. I took the chance to check in with Kramer. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding like he'd aged a decade in 24 hours. Your guy Avery's been getting anonymous mail, he said. A second package turned up at his hotel this morning. Smaller, no device. Just ashes. Human ashes, according to preliminary tests. We're running DNA. Mida Avery, possibly, or someone else's morbid joke. Either way, it's getting weird. Anything else? There was a note, typed. Single line. No signature. He read it to me. It must be carried forward, or it dies with me. That took the wind out of me for half a second. You want Wolfe to see it? I already had a copy delivered. If he throws it in the fireplace, tell him I'll be outside with a warrant. I relayed all this to Wolfe, who listened with his hands steepled and his eyes half-lidded like a monk, halfway through a riddle. Archie, fetch the envelope and note. He examined them both for 2 full minutes without speaking. Then almost lazily he said, We are no longer looking for a saboteur. We are looking for a disciple, a follower, an inheritor. Someone who believes they are continuing her work, whether by instruction or delusion. Someone who thinks fire was her legacy. Yes. And we will bring them here. I raised an eyebrow. We. You will make the invitations, Mr. Avery, Miss Marwick, Mr. Sorrel, and Miss Downs of Emberlight. She doesn't have a motive. She has ideology, Wolfe said, which is, in such cases, far more combustible. I started to leave, but paused at the door. What's the bait? You will tell them. Wolfe said, his eyes fixed on the note, that a 3rd device has been discovered, and that we will reveal its intended target tomorrow evening here. That's a lie. It is leverage. I spent the rest of the afternoon crafting phone calls that balanced urgency with plausibility. None of them argued. They would be at the brownstone at 6 p.m. sharp the next day. Whatever Wolfe was cooking up, he'd just raised the temperature. By nightfall, the drizzle had turned to steady rain, and the brownstone was quiet. Fritz served duck confit with a side of silence, and I didn't push it. Wolfe was deep in the gears of whatever mental trap he was designing, and I knew better than to interrupt an engineer during assembly. As I was rinsing the last of the wine glasses, Wolfe finally spoke. Whoever is responsible has rationalized their act as justice, which means they must be made to see it as failure. You plan to shame them? No. I plan to reveal that they misunderstood their own gospel. That is more damning than prison. And with that he retired to the plant room again. Outside, the rain hissed against the windows like something whispering secrets. Inside, the trap was set, and the fire was waiting for its name. They arrived one by one, each carrying something invisible but unmistakable. Expectation. Duncan Avery was first, his overcoat damp at the shoulders, eyes flicking around the entryway like he expected the walls to whisper. Then Ellen Morwick, clutching a tightly folded umbrella and wearing a storm grey cardigan like armor. David Sorrell followed, hands in pockets, jaw set. Last was Maritza Downs, punctual to the second, her expression unreadable but sharp enough to leave paper cuts. Wolfe, of course, didn't meet them at the door. He wouldn't have opened it for the Pope. That fell to me. As always, I took their coats, made small talk in the front room, and then escorted them, one by one, into the office, where the air was warm, dry and heavy with orchid scent and something more subtle, consequence. Wolfe remained in his chair, mountainous and unmoving, arms resting along the leather like the throne had grown around him. He didn't greet them. Wolfe never greeted people when he planned to interrogate them. He simply observed, and in that room, silence was a scalpel. Once all four were seated, a very fidgeting Marwick watching Wolfe, Sorrell staring at his knees, and Downs crossing her legs in elegant measured defiance. Wolfe spoke. There has been another package. That was it. No preamble, just the weight of that sentence dropping like a trapdoor. They didn't all react at once. Ellen blinked. Maritza tilted her head slightly. Sorrell straightened, alert. Avery was the one who bit. Another? Where? Wolfe ignored him. This one was smaller. Delivered to Mr. Avery's hotel room this morning. No mechanism. Just ashes. And a note. At that, even Ellen's composure cracked. Ashes? Human, Wolfe said. Preliminary analysis suggests cremains. There is no identification yet, but the message was unambiguous. He gestured to me and I stepped forward, producing a copy of the note. One line typed clean and cold. It must be carried forward, or it dies with me. The silence that followed wasn't blank, it was charged. Sorrell's eyes were on the paper, unmoving. Ellen sat back, lips pressed so tight they were nearly white. Avery shifted again, visibly shaken. Maritza was the only one who leaned forward. So now you're calling us here to accuse us. I call no one to accuse, Wolfe said. I call to understand. You are here because each of you inherited something from Maida Avery. Money, memories, responsibility. Perhaps more responsibility, Sorrell said, almost scoffing. She cut me out of her life 6 months before she died. I hadn't heard from her since. But you kept her notes, Wolfe said, without hesitation. Her methods, that hit him like a slap. His eyes darted to me, then back to Wolfe. You don't know that. I do, because you did not deny it when you had the chance. Nor did you show me any proof to the contrary. But more importantly, she left you part of the estate, despite severing ties. Why? Sorrell looked cornered. Not guilty. There's a difference, but it's a close cousin. She wanted me to continue the work. Or maybe she regretted how things ended. I don't know, but you believe she had unfinished business, Wolfe said. You are not alone in that. He turned to Maritza, Mrs. Downs, the foundation. Maida gave it her name, her philosophy, her money, but not her rules. Did she ever give you a manifesto? She gave us vision, Maritza said. Not instruction. She wanted us to teach fire safety. Yes, but also to inspire, to make people think, to stir the world a little, to stir it with fire. She didn't flinch. It's a metaphor, Mr. Wolfe. One she used often, and not irresponsibly. Did you ever meet any of her academic adversaries? No. Did she ever mention by name the institutions or individuals who obstructed her career? She never said names, only that some people feared what they didn't understand. Which is another way of saying they refused her grant applications. Wolfe let that hang in the air. then looked to Ellen Marwick. You knew her longest. I did, and best. I like to think so. Did she share her final wishes with you? Beyond the No. She became more private near the end. Obsessive. About what? She spoke often about legacy. She said fire lives in principle, not in heat. I didn't understand it. Still don't. But someone did. Wolfe said. Now he turned to Avery. You were the recipient of the first package. The only one whose life has been directly disrupted. Why? Avery looked lost. I don't know. I loved her, but we weren't close. She didn't confide in me. She did. Wolfe raised a hand, and the room fell quiet again. You are all here, because one among you, perhaps unknowingly, perhaps not, has continued Maida Avery's legacy. Not as philosophy, but as execution. 2 fires, both following symbolic deliveries, one of which nearly cost lives, and now a third delivery. Not destructive, but declarative. He paused. And here is what I find most instructive. All 3 recipients, Mr. Avery, the deceased dean, and the first anonymous target, have one thing in common. Each played a role, directly or indirectly, in what Maida Avery viewed as the failure of her vision. 2 were deniers of funding. 1, her family. That made Avery bristle. You think I did something to deserve this? No, Wolfe said, but I believe someone thinks you did. And the person who sent the packages knows your history, and hers. He looked at each of them, slow and deliberate. This is not the act of a saboteur. It is the act of a believer. One who thinks fire is not just punishment, but instruction. Then he turned to me. Archie. The list. I opened the folder I'd kept on the table beside me and read aloud. 3 people declined Maida Avery's grant proposals in the last 2 decades. 2 are dead, 1 of heart failure, 1 in the first fire. The third is living in upstate New York under hospice care, and now under watch. Of the 4 people here, only 1 visited all 3 of them in the last year. One of it. I looked up at Maritza Downs. She didn't speak. Not right away. When she did, it was without panic, without denial. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. Wolfe inclined his head. No. But you believed her cause had been diluted. You found her notes. Or perhaps she left them for you. And you decided a few demonstrations would make the message clearer. I used what she built, Maritza said. Her research, her principles. I thought if I could just show people what had been taken from her, the world would finally listen. You used fire as metaphor, Wolfe said. But flame does not accept metaphor. It consumes, regardless of intent. She lowered her gaze. Did you send the ashes? Yes, she said quietly. They were hers. I retrieved them. I thought Duncan needed to see what he'd lost, what he didn't understand. Ellen let out a breath like she'd been punched. Sorrel just shook his head. Wolfe didn't look triumphant, just resolved. Miss Downs, he said, I believe you should accompany Mr. Goodwin now. He will take you to Inspector Kramer, who is expecting you. He will listen. You would do well to tell him everything. She stood slowly. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. You chose fire, Wolfe said. It never asks permission. She followed me out without a word. And just like that, the storm passed. Later that evening, Wolfe sat in silence, at dinner, pushing a spoon through broth. When I finally broke the quiet, I asked, You believe she really thought she was honoring Maida? Yes, Wolfe said. Which is why she was dangerous. I nodded and picked up my fork. Still, I said, hell of a way to carry a torch. Wolfe scowled. Archie, do be silent. The next morning, the brownstone was quiet in that peculiar way. It gets after a case has exhaled, peaceful but not quite serene. Wolfe had already told Kramer everything Maritza confessed on the ride over, and Kramer for once hadn't roared. Maybe it was the hour. Maybe it was the oddity of a woman setting fires to teach lessons. Or maybe it was because Wolfe had gift-wrapped the entire affair without demanding a fee. He does that sometimes. Acts like justice is its own reward. Just to remind me he's the one with principles and I'm the one with rent. We were halfway through breakfast. Eggs, soft, toast, crisp, butter, precisely room temperature, when Wolfe spoke, not looking up from his plate. She was not mad. Who? I asked, though I already knew. Maritza Downs. She was not insane. She was unmoored. There is a difference. I chewed for a moment, then said, that's a generous distinction for someone who lit up 2 buildings and mailed cremated remains like party favors. Wolfe grunted. She was dangerous, yes, but only because she lacked tethering. Maida Avery gave her ideology without boundaries, intellect without ethics. She believed herself chosen, not simply inspired. I sipped coffee, leaning back. That's what happens when smart people mistake obsession for purpose. She mistook symbolism for action, he said. The gravest confusion of all. There was a pause. Wolfe buttered a second slice of toast as delicately as a watchmaker oils a gear. When he did finally speak again, it was to no one in particular. I have no patience for zealots, Archie. They always forget the cost of their convictions. I let that sit while the smell of orchids crept in from the hallway. We'd gotten lucky this time. No one had died. Not this week. But the ashes Maritza had sent. Those had once been Maida, and Maida had once been brilliant, fiery and very much alive. Now, she was just an echo her admirer tried to weaponize. Kramer had agreed to hold off charges, at least until the psychological review. Wolfe suspected she wouldn't be found criminally insane, but I didn't argue. It wasn't my call to make. She wasn't my flame to put out. Later that morning, Duncan Avery called. He wanted to thank Wolfe. Wolfe refused the call. He did, however, permit me to pass along his statement. Tell Mr. Avery, I abhor melodrama, and that sentimentality is no substitute for reflection. Duncan responded, I don't know if that's an insult or a lesson. I told him with Wolfe, it's usually both. By noon, Ellen Marwick sent a handwritten note. Not an email, not a voicemail, but actual pen on paper saying she hoped Wolfe found the resolution he sought. She enclosed a clipping from a scientific journal, a 1986 interview with Maida Avery, in which she described fire as the most honest element, ruthless, immediate, and never halfway. Wolfe read it once, grunted, and put it in the drawer beside the file cabinet, under a folder labeled ideologues in his own thick handwriting. After that, things slowed to a crawl. No doorbells, no packages, no looming threat. Even Fritz seemed lighter on his feet. He served veal for lunch and didn't once glance toward the foyer. I did what I usually do between storms, sorted notes, filed receipts, and cleaned my desk, which always took less time than I hoped. Around 4, I wandered into the office. Wolfe had a book open on his lap. Lucretius, I think, and one eye half closed. I stood in the doorway and waited until he noticed me. When he did, he said, you are idle. Only in body. He didn't dignify that. I sat. It was almost elegant, I said. The way she staged it. The deliveries, the symbols, the note. If she hadn't gone that far, she might have founded a lecture series. She chose impact over dialogue, Wolfe said, a fatal error in both science and society. She had to believe she was finishing something. No, Wolfe said, she believed she was beginning something. That is what made her dangerous. I thought about that. Then I asked the question that had been poking at the back of my mind since she'd confessed in the office. Do you think Maida knew what she was setting in motion? Wolfe was silent a moment. Yes, he said, but not how far it would go. He closed the book with a soft sound. She left seeds, not a map. Miss Downs followed the path she imagined, not the one that was drawn. Faith without instruction. Worse, he said, direction without destination. I let the silence linger. Outside, the sky had cleared, and a golden light filtered through the window. The kind of light that makes even a room full of shadows look forgiving. Eventually I rose, stretched, and said, if you'll excuse me, I think I'll walk down to the corner for some air. Dinner in 1 hour. Wolfe said without looking up. Fritz tell you what he's making? No. But I requested trout. If he deviates, I will know. I left him to his paper kingdom and stepped outside. The city smelled fresh, like someone had wrung it out and hung it to dry. A passing cab kicked up a spray near the curb, but I was light on my feet and sidestepped it without effort. The walk didn't clear my head so much as reset it. Not all cases end with handcuffs or headlines. Some just simmer down, like a pot pulled from the burner at the right second. Still hot, still dangerous, but no longer active. As I reached the corner, I saw a small girl standing beside a mailbox, clutching a book twice her size. Her mother stood nearby, giving instructions on how to fold a letter. Fire, Wolfe had said, was honest. But so was a child trying to send a message into the world. On the way back, I passed a newspaper stand. A small headline caught my eye. Emberlight Foundation temporarily suspends operations. I didn't buy it. I didn't need to. The flame had dimmed. Back at the brownstone, Fritz opened the door just as I reached it. The smell of trout and lemon wafted into the hall. Wolfe's voice floated from the dining room. Archie, wash your hands. You've been near a newspaper stand. And with that, the case of the fire that started at dusk became another file in the cabinet. The ashes cooled, the orchids bloomed, and dinner, as always, was served on time. The following day was gray and moody, the kind of day New York does best, thick with fog and soaked in car horns. It was the kind of morning that made you question every decision from your haircut to your career. But inside Wolfe's brownstone, the coffee was hot, the air was warm, and the chairs were just as unforgiving as ever. I sat in the office with the morning paper in one hand and a sharpened pencil in the other. Wolfe doesn't do puzzles, but I do. Crossword, cryptogram, scrambled quotes, anything that kills time without requiring meaningful effort. He was upstairs in the plant rooms where he always goes after breakfast to commune with the orchids like they're senators who still return his calls. Around 10, the doorbell rang. I set the pencil down, opened the door, and found Saul Panzer standing there in a brown overcoat, expression neutral and haircut as stubborn as ever. Morning, he said. You alone? I let him in, alone and undercaffeinated. Wolves upstairs neck deep in chlorophyll. Come on in. He followed me to the office and removed his coat with the caution of a man expecting a trap. I handed him a cup of coffee, which he accepted with a nod. Don't tell me you brought another firebug, I said. The last one just left. Saul didn't smile. This is a different sort of smoke. That got my attention. Saul Panzer doesn't deal in metaphor. He deals in facts. And when he shows up without being summoned, it means those facts are pointing somewhere Wolfe doesn't like being pointed. What kind of smoke? I asked. He set his coffee down, reached into his coat, and pulled out a file. I've been digging. Wolfe wanted to know if anyone else had access to Maida Avery's private papers. Anyone besides the named heirs. Let me guess, I said. You found someone. He nodded. I tracked down her lawyer. Guy named Turlough. Very buttoned up. She didn't leave much with him. She liked her secrets analog, but she did keep a small storage unit in Midtown, paid in cash. No key in the will, no mention of it in her estate. I whistled. Hidden lab, diary of vengeance, recipe for flame retardant oatmeal? He didn't blink. Something worse. The unit had been emptied the day after her funeral. Security footage shows a woman matching Ellen Marwick's description entering with a duffel and exiting without it. That gave me a pause. She said she was in Maine that week. Saul nodded. That's what I thought too. So I called the friend Irene Delancey. Irene vouched for her. She did. Only, she now remembers Ellen taking a solo walk one night. Said she didn't question it at the time. Ellen was grieving. I stood, the chair groaning behind me. So Ellen lied. Not conclusively. But she definitely detoured. Why? Saul opened the file. I think Ellen was Maida's confidant in more ways than she admitted. According to Delancey, Ellen used to joke that Maida's legacy wouldn't fit in a will. Meaning she may have known exactly where that storage unit was, possibly even helped Maida set it up. Maybe it was a fallback plan. I walked to the window and stared out at the misty street. She was calm, polished. She didn't even flinch when Wolfe laid it all out. Which makes her more dangerous than Downs, Saul said. Downs wanted to honor Maida. Ellen might have wanted to finish what Maida started. I didn't like it. And not just because I'd liked Ellen's tea service. I didn't like the idea of a second firebug, lying in wait, one who knew how to hide her fingerprints. You tell Wolfe, I asked. I came here first. Of course you did. Just then, I heard the familiar footfalls on the stairs, measured, deliberate, heavy with intent. Wolfe entered the office with that specific expression he wears when he already knows what Saul brought. He looked at me, then at Saul, and nodded once. You have found something. Saul handed over the file. Wolfe took it, sat, and read. No sound but the paper. After a moment he looked up. She returned to the city under the cover of grief, recovered something not hers, lied about her whereabouts, and sat in this office, feet from the truth, without blinking. Cool, under pressure, I said. No, Wolfe said, cold, detached. She allowed Maritza Downs to carry the burden, possibly even encouraged it. You think Ellen was the real mastermind? I asked. She had the means, the motive, and the temperament, but no conviction. She did not act. She nudged. She planted. He leaned back in the chair, his bulk making the leather groan. She weaponized faith. Miss Downs was merely the fuse. Saul stood. You want me to bring her in? No, Wolfe said. Not yet. He closed the file with precision and tapped a finger on its spine. Arrange for Miss Marwick to return this afternoon, under the pretext of clarifying a minor detail in her testimony. Archie will make the call. I knew better than to ask what detail. By 3 o'clock. Ellen was back in the office, polite as ever, scarf draped just so, hair immaculate. Mr. Wolfe, she said smoothly, I was surprised to hear from you again. You should not be, Wolfe said. You lied to me. That cracked the facade. Slightly. Excuse me? You were not in Maine the entire week of Maida's funeral. You were in Manhattan, at a storage unit she kept secret from her estate attorney. Ellen didn't blink. I don't know what you're talking about. You do, Wolfe said. You retrieved her private papers, possibly her final formulations. You knew what she meant when she said fire lives in principle. You knew she intended to leave behind a legacy outside the will. You encouraged Maritza Downs to act upon it, knowing she lacked the clarity to question it. Ellen folded her hands in her lap. That's quite an accusation. No, Wolfe said. It is a statement. Miss Downs believed she was acting alone. But the ashes, the note, the timing, it was all curated by someone who never planned to strike the match, but knew who would. Her voice lowered. I never told her to do anything. Of course not, Wolfe said. You merely let her believe Maida would have wanted it. And then you let her burn. She stood. This conversation is over. No, Wolfe said. It has not begun. She turned to leave and I stepped into the doorway, arms folded. Now, Miss Marwick, Wolfe said, you will walk into that hall and you will find a car waiting with Inspector Kramer inside. You will speak with him. You may choose what you confess, but I assure you he will be listening. She paused at the door. She was a genius, she said softly, and the world called her dangerous. So I gave it a reason to remember her. And then she walked out. I turned to Wolfe. Was that justice? No, Wolfe said. That was a cautionary tale. And with that he rang for beer. Dinner that evening was quiet, even by Wolfe's standards. Fritz had prepared guinea hen braised with fennel and thyme, accompanied by a silky parsnip puree and sautéed dandelion greens. I wasn't in a position to complain. He could have served stale breadcrumbs and I would have eaten them, just to stay in the room. Wolfe was silent for most of the meal, chewing with mechanical patience, his gaze focused just beyond the table as if still mentally filing away pieces of the puzzle. We were, technically speaking, done. Maritza Downs had confessed. Ellen Marwick had been handed over to Kramer, who for once didn't yell or argue when Wolfe laid out the final structure of the crime. He just sat with a legal pad and a pencil, occasionally jotting things down like a man trying to translate poetry into police code. He didn't need a warrant this time. Ellen had walked out of the brownstone and into the waiting car of her own volition, graceful to the last, but done in Wolfe's book. Doesn't mean finished. It means the facts are aligned. The consequences. Those usually came later. When Fritz brought in the chocolate mousse, Wolfe finally spoke. She was clever, he said. I put my spoon down. Marwick. Yes. Not brilliant, but effective. She understood the limitations of her influence and chose to exercise it through others. Miss Downs was the ideal instrument, committed, emotionally charged, and easily steered. She handed her a matchbook and walked away. Precisely. And remained just far enough outside the flame to preserve her own hands. I let that sit a minute. You think she planned the whole thing? No. But she allowed it. She could have stopped Miss Downs at any point. Instead, she withheld context and let interpretation do the rest. A passive crime, I said. Facilitated by omission. A common but underestimated form of guilt, Wolfe said. She saw herself as the guardian of Maida Avery's ideals. She believed the world needed a correction and lacked the courage to enact it herself. So she nudged another into doing it poorly. She looked me in the eye and lied. Wolfe sniffed. She also looked at me and lied. Do not take it personally, Archie. She lied to herself long before she lied to us. When dinner concluded, we moved back into the office. Wolfe settled into his chair, crossing his hands over his stomach like a judge preparing a verdict. I poured myself a brandy, his, not mine, and took the red armchair. What happens to them? I asked. Kramer will charge Miss Downs with reckless endangerment, arson, and unlawful handling of human remains, Wolfe said. Miss Marwick will be more complicated. Unless Miss Downs names her in testimony, her role may remain advisory, morally contemptible, but legally difficult to pin down. Kramer won't like that. He never does. I leaned back and let the brandy settle. Outside, the rain had started again. A soft drumming on the windows like the world tapping out an apology it would never deliver. Inside, the room was dim, but warm. A small fire crackled in the grate. Not symbolic, just functional. Want to hear something? I said. No, Wolfe said. I told him anyway. I think Downs loved Maida. Not romantically, but deeply. She thought Maida was a prophet. She was not alone, Wolfe said. Visionaries attract shadows, and Marwick goes. She loved her too, but differently. Maida was her mirror, her measure, her justification. Without her, Ellen was just a woman with beliefs. I finished the brandy in silence. Wolfe didn't speak again until the clock chimed 10. Do you know why this case offended me, Archie? I looked over. Because someone disturbed your dinner schedule, lied in your office, burned a hole in your reality. No, he said, eyes half-lidded. Because it was not about power. It was about purity. I raised an eyebrow. Purity, he repeated, is the most dangerous of all motives. It justifies the unforgivable. It ignores consequence. It sanctifies destruction. He paused, then added, it is the opposite of reason. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. Eventually, Wolfe reached for the bell and rang for Fritz. The fire had gone out. The dishes were done. The brownstone was whole again. But before I left the office for the night, I looked at the file cabinet. One more folder had been added that afternoon. A very Maida incident. The fire at Dusk. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Every detail was already burned into my head. The next morning came as they always do, reluctant, cold, and unapologetic. Wolfe went up to the orchids. Fritz went to the kitchen. I went to the front door to retrieve the mail. Among the usual pile of bills and catalogs, there was a single envelope addressed to Wolfe in a careful, deliberate hand. Inside was a small photograph, black and white, old. It showed Maida Avery, seated at a lab bench smiling faintly, with a Bunsen burner glowing beside her like a tame flame. No note. No sender. No threat. Just a moment. Captured and mailed. A kind of final word. I brought it inside and placed it on Wolfe's desk. He looked at it, studied it, then turned it face down. "Let the dead rest, Archie," he said quietly. "They've burned enough." I nodded, took the photo, and slid it into the file folder. Some flames are never meant to be fanned. Some fires you extinguish. Others, you just close the door and walk away. And that, as they say, was that. It wasn't over. You'd think after orchestrating a calm intellectual dismantling of a philosophical arson conspiracy, Wolfe would resume his usual lifestyle of orchid schedules and butter preferences. I expected things to settle back into the well-oiled, buttered and bracketed routine of the brownstone. And for a day or two it did. But then the letter came. Not a package, not another vial or urn or poetic fire trap, just a letter, postmarked, from Albany. Typed. No return address. Wolfe opened it in front of me in the office, and as his eyes swept the page, I saw the corners of his mouth twitch, almost imperceptibly, which in Wolfe terms is the emotional equivalent of a Broadway gasp. He passed it across the desk. "To Mr. Nero Wolfe. You missed one. Sincerely, E." That was it. No fire. No ashes. Just a sentence. A provocation. I read it 3 times before looking up. "You think it's Downs? Maybe Marwick's still pulling strings?" "No," Wolfe said. "Downs is in a hospital psychiatric unit under observation. Marwick is being watched by the FBI's Behavioral Threat Assessment Unit at Kramer's suggestion. Neither is in Albany. And neither would sign it like this. Et. Maida Avery. You think she sent it?" "No," he said, voice sharpening. "But someone who wishes to impersonate her, philosophically at least." I slid the letter into a clear sleeve and tucked it under the file marked Avery. "What does it mean?" He turned toward the windows, the orchids visible beyond the glass. "It means the ideology survived, the theology of fire, and that its next disciple may not be as naive as Miss Downs or as reserved as Miss Marwick." That night I didn't sleep well. The brown stone was warm, secure, and locked tighter than a bank vault, but my dreams smelled faintly of smoke and typing paper. The next morning, I called Saul Panzer. If someone was impersonating Avery, he was the guy to find the matchbook. "Leave it with me," Saul said. "I'll trace the postmark." Albany's got 55 drop boxes, but only 3 sorting facilities. If they used a self-serve kiosk, I might get a timestamp. Wolfe thinks it's a new player. That makes 3 of us. I gave him the envelope and the photo from the previous mail, the one of Maida in her lab, smiling faintly. I didn't like that it had shown up alone, unexplained. At the time, I'd let it go, but now it felt like an opening move. Wolfe didn't issue any grand directives. He just sat in the office more than usual, listening, reading, glancing at the phone like he was waiting for a tune-up call from the devil. Late afternoon, I got a call from Kramer. "We found something," he said, voice tight. There was another device, unignited, in the home of Professor Duncan Bell, who, head of the physics department at a college upstate. He was the 3rd and final major denial in Avery's funding history. Retired now. Nearly blind. Lives alone. Was it mailed? No. Left on his porch. No return address. No note. It's nearly identical to the first one. Same frame. Same temperature-sensitive vial. Same accelerant residue. But it didn't go off. His caretaker found it while sweeping the steps. I whistled. "So we've got a new arsonist, but more careful. Or more deliberate," Kramer growled. They wanted it found. Another warning. Or a test. After I hung up, I gave Wolfe the news. He didn't react the way I expected. No sigh, no scowl, just a nod, like he'd already anticipated the device. Maybe even the target. 3 recipients, he said, each connected to the defunding of Avery's career. 2 burned, 1 spared. Each fire, or near fire, prefaced by a symbolic delivery, and each with the same philosophy behind it. Fire as message. Yes, Wolfe said. But this one differs. No ignition, only potential. That implies escalation or hesitation. Think we scared them off? No, Wolfe said. I think they're inviting a reply. That evening, Wolfe instructed me to call Duncan Avery. Why? I asked. He's already been through enough. First a fire, then a box of his aunt's ashes. The man deserves a nap. He is the only person who had access to both Marwick and Downs in the months before Maida Avery's death. He is also the one recipient of a delivery that occurred after the funeral. You think he's the new disciple? No, Wolfe said, but I think he may have created one. Avery arrived the next morning, pale and a little frayed around the edges. He wore a suit that hadn't been tailored in a decade, and shoes that needed polish. The man looked exhausted in his bones. I haven't heard from Ellen, he said as he sat. Or Maritza. Is that a good sign? No, Wolfe said flatly. It is a quiet sign. Avery glanced at me, then back to Wolfe. You didn't call me here to make conversation. No, Wolfe said. I called you here because you missed something. He passed Avery a copy of the Albany letter. Avery read it once. Then again. This isn't from Ellen. No. Then who? That, Wolfe said, is what you will tell me. Avery's mouth opened, closed. Then he said slowly, there was a student. Wolfe didn't move. A PhD candidate. I tutored him years ago, chemistry and engineering. He idolized my aunt. Read everything she wrote, even the unpublished papers she kept in a box in the closet. Name, Wolfe said. Julian Ray. You kept in contact. He visited after her death, brought flowers, asked about the ashes, her notebooks. I didn't think anything of it. He was intense, but smart. Too smart. Avery nodded, then whispered. He asked me if she ever regretted not finishing her work. Wolfe gave a slow exhale through his nose. And what did you tell him? I said she always believed the world had failed her, not the other way around. And now he is proving her right, Wolfe said. We had our answer. Not a relative, not a close associate. A disciple formed, not through instruction, but inheritance of grief and admiration. A man who'd read her words, watched the headlines, seen the fire, and decided the story was unfinished. Saul will find him, Wolfe said, and Kramer will deal with him. Avery looked defeated. I didn't mean to. No, Wolfe said, but like Miss Marwick, you told a story, and someone else wrote the ending. Avery left quietly. He didn't shake hands. After he was gone, I looked at Wolfe. You think this Ray kid's planning another fire? No, Wolfe said. He is planning a sermon. You mean, a public statement. A final message. A correction. It will be symbolic, and it will be spectacular. You want to stop it. I intend to redirect it. And that's when Wolfe leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and began to dictate. A letter to Julian Ray. The letter Wolfe dictated was short, precise, and dense with purpose. He never used more words than necessary, but this time, even by his standards, it was spare, like each line was a knife meant to puncture a very specific delusion. I typed it up, unsigned, and printed it on Wolfe's thick cream stationery. We mailed it from a drop box 2 blocks away. No return address, no fingerprint, just a destination. A campus P.O. box in Albany, tied to one Julian Ray, PhD candidate, aspiring chemist, and if Wolfe was right, the last flame-bearer in a chain of righteous combustion. By then, Saul had confirmed his identity, age 27. Published 3 minor articles on thermodynamics, and once co-presented a panel at a regional science conference alongside Maida Avery. That was 5 years ago. She'd been impressed with him. Wolfe found the transcript and circled a line Maida had said aloud on stage. This young man understands that fire is not just destruction, it is punctuation. I knew what Wolfe was doing with the letter. He was setting punctuation of his own. 3 days passed. On the 4th, something arrived. A package. Not a box this time. A flat envelope, thick paper. No stamps, just hand-delivered to the front door in the middle of the night. Fritz found it when he opened up at 6 in the morning and brought it into the office like it was radioactive. Inside, a USB drive. That alone would have been enough to make Wolfe scoff, but I'd anticipated that. I ran the scan in my own machine, isolated, scrubbed, no connection to anything. What played on the screen was a single video. Grainy footage. One shot, static camera, placed in what looked like a lecture hall. Julian Ray stood at the front, talking to an empty room. No audience, no students, no press. Just a man explaining himself to a camera, as if one day someone would need the testimony. I wanted to build something, he said. Not just burn. I wanted people to see, to understand what Maida tried to do. But you stopped that. All of you. And maybe you were right. He paused. Maybe fire isn't the answer. Maybe knowledge is. Maybe knowledge